It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. When President Donald Trump took office, he promised to crack down on immigration. He's done that. Since January of 2025, at least 2,400 immigrants were arrested in Michigan alone. But saying that makes it seem like President Trump and immigration officials are following an orderly process. The truth is, officials are often skirting the law or violating it. This was visible months ago in Minneapolis when masked ICE agents shot and killed Renee Good and Alex Preddy, and thousands took to the streets. Here in Michigan, the work of ICE is harder to spot. But due to action in the courts, we've been learning more. Federal judges recently ruled that hundreds of people in Michigan were unconstitutionally detained as they never had a chance of being released on bond. For its part, the administration says it's detaining the worst of the worst. But in many cases, non-citizens with no criminal record have been detained. So what do ICE arrests and detentions look like in Metro Detroit? What are the stories of those who've been detained? How are local police involved in the work? And who's fighting back? Violet Ekonomova is an investigative reporter for the Detroit Free Press. She's been looking into all of this. Violet, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
So first, Violet, why did you come to investigate the way ICE has been detaining non-citizens in Metro Detroit?
It actually happened kind of randomly. I got a tip from a woman down in Texas who knew a man who had been detained in Michigan. And the story she told me was about the fact that a judge had ordered his release, but that ICE was holding him for a few days longer than the day he was said he was supposed to be released. And then she started telling me about his case. And this man had dotted all of his I's, crossed all of his T's to stay in the country. He got to the country. Technically, he entered illegally, but he checked himself in at the country's Mexican border, the city of Juarez, at the U.S. consulate there. From there, they allowed him into the country, DHS employees, and then he applied for asylum. As she's telling me his story, I'm like, whoa, sounds like this guy did everything he was supposed to do. I think you're kind of burying the lead, tipster. And then I found his case. I got in touch with his lawyer, and his lawyer started explaining to me, oh, yeah, no, this judge granted his release. A bunch of my clients, their releases are being granted. And then a colleague of mine, Dave Boucher, who is also on the reporting, he found a way to search federal court records specifically for these types of cases called habeas corpus. So if somebody alleges they're being illegally detained, that is their avenue for release. And in the Detroit's federal court, we were able to find over 100 of these cases. And there are far more on the west side of the state where North Lake Processing Center is, the largest ICE detention center in the Midwest.
Okay, Violet, so you're saying a couple of things here that are really striking. One, that there are folks who are trying to move through the system and obtain legal status properly. And that is not being a factor that is at all considered among immigration officials. Something else that you pointed out as well is that the administration, and we know this is happening in multiple arenas right now in the country, is not listening to judges. They're not listening to the judicial system. I want to start with that. So federal judges recently ruled here in Michigan that hundreds of people were unconstitutionally detained as they never had a chance of being released on bond. And you reported on some of the judges who specifically said the detainments were illegal. I want to talk about that first. What were their comments about these cases?
They said that it comes down to practice. So there's an immigration law, and for the past 30 years, it's been followed in such a way where if you have lived in the United States for a period of time, you are not eligible for mandatory detention. The only non-citizens eligible for mandatory detention historically has been people who committed a crime, or if you are just arriving in the country, you're technically detained, and they determine whether or not to send you back to the country you came from or allow you into the nation. Like the man who anchored this reporting, who I got the tip about, he was allowed into the country to pursue his asylum claim. And so now the Trump administration has changed the rules. In July, they started treating these folks differently. They said that they had come into the country because they had come into the country illegally, or without permission, they were also eligible for mandatory detention.
Okay, so the Trump administration is essentially responding to these rulings by changing their rules.
Yes, well, and so the judges said no. This is not the meaning of. This is not the spirit of the act. This is not the meaning of the act. And then they have appealed, and so they've appealed to the way the appeal system works in the country. Every region has an appellate court. They have successfully appealed in the Fifth Circuit, which is a notoriously conservative circuit. And then they have appealed in the circuit covering Michigan. We're still waiting on the results of that. And they also got a favorable ruling in the Eighth Circuit. So more than likely, if there are differing opinions between the appellate courts, this may eventually go before the Supreme Court. And if it ends, that's going to be a key avenue for immigrants to win release, deaded. So, yeah. But I do want to stress that, a lot of these folks, they were held in detention for 3 months on average before a judge weighed in and said, you shouldn't be here at all. Or you need to be released or given a bond hearing. That does not make their case go away. They're still on the path to deportation. They still have to go on and fight their case.
Well, let's talk about some of these actual cases. I mean, you investigated over 100 of them where non-citizens were detained by ICE, had sued for release because they weren't given a bond hearing. They are sitting in immigration jail for months on end. Talk about what some of the common threads were in these cases.
Yeah, so the reason we started looking at this is because I feel like, and I maybe listeners have a sense as well, that Michigan, what happened in Minneapolis, what's happened in LA, what's happened in Chicago has been so in your face. Yeah. And these cases started to give us a sense of like what was unfolding more quietly in Michigan. And so from the pool of folks who were who alleged they were unlawfully detained, mind you, judges overwhelmingly ruled that they indeed were unlawfully detained. In 89 cases, they ruled, yes, you're unlawfully detained. Only in 2 cases did they rule that they were not unlawfully detained in the cases we looked at. But we wanted to drill down further to look at how these enforcements had been unfolding in the state of Michigan specifically. So we zeroed in on people who listed their residence as in Michigan, or who had lived in the country, or who or who had been arrested in the state. And so we looked at 104 cases. We found that the majority had lived in the United States for more than a decade. At least a dozen came to the country as minors. A quarter of them were parents, often of U.S. citizen children. One guy had his baby. His baby was born just days after he was detained. At least a third were employed. At least a half dozen owned businesses or property. So they had deep roots. And the reason I thought that was important to drill down on is because polling shows that folks do not support Trump's immigration agenda when it comes to people who've been in the country for a long period of time and who do not have criminal records. Polling shows that about 59% of people are actively against deporting people without criminal records who've been here a long time. Only 23% of people support it. So I thought that that was an important thing to drill down on. And then from there, we also have other stats. A lot of people, the leading way these people got into the pipeline was they were detained through traffic stops. And half of those traffic stops were by local law enforcement agencies, which hopefully we'll get to talk about shortly. And then a lot of them were taken while trying to comply. So of the a little over 100, dozens were in a legal process to stay in the U.S. with pending asylum cases or residency applications. They had government-issued work permits, and at least 9 of them were picked up during immigration case check-ins at government offices. So they were in the active process of complying with this nation's laws about immigration when they were nabbed.
Violet, that is a point that I want to stay on for a moment, because there are folks who are going to say you were in the country illegally, and so if we're going to follow the rule of law, then you must be removed. But when you talk about the people who were following the proper pathways towards citizenship, it sounds like even for those folks, there was no pathway.
Yeah, the New York Times had a great article a couple of days ago, kind of going deeper into what has gone on behind the scenes with Stephen Miller's immigration agenda. And it spoke to, the Trump administration has said we're going after the worst of the worst, but the architect of the immigration campaign wants to get everybody who entered the country without permission. And that to him means, presumably based on all of these people who've been nabbed, that includes a guy like Carlos Santo Domingo Sanchez, who we write about, who the tip came in about, somebody who checked in at the U.S. consulate, was given permission to come into the country to pursue an asylum case, given temporary protected status because he came from a country in economic upheaval. He came from Venezuela, a country where the U.S. said, we don't like your dictator, so much so that they even took the guy out. Carlos was trying to flee from that dictator. So, they say the worst of the worst publicly, but what's going on behind the scenes is anybody who came here and is not a citizen is,
This presents a lot of complexity, Violet. You're talking about countries where the U.S. has played a large role in disrupting life and destabilizing life and governments. And then when folks flee to the place where that's at the center of it all, which is the U.S., they are facing consequences, as you've been discussing. I want to look at one of the cases specifically, and that is the case of Eric Pena. He came here when he was a minor in 2013. He was arrested when an ICE agent broke the window of a vehicle he was in and forced him out. Eric has since been released. But Violet, I'm wondering why he was arrested in the first place and why this was done so dramatically.
He has no idea why he was arrested. He can't make sense of why he was arrested beyond potential racial profiling. What has happened, though? Okay, so that's his sense of why he was arrested. He was driving in a car with. He was being driven in a car by it was an immigrant advocacy group. I'm blanking on the very specific details. They were reported really well by MLive initially. But it was an immigrant advocacy group. He was in the back seat. I'm not sure if ICE knew of this group or what. But what we have heard from the Michigan Immigration Rights Center is that a lot of people are getting trapped or picked up because those folks who are trying to comply and who have pending cases, ICE has their information. And so that is the assessment of them, that they do see a little bit of racial profiling going on. There are police stops that have no explanation of why they occurred. ICE stops, local police stops, and that's where they suspect racial profiling might be going on, like Pena suspected. But they also say that a lot of the time ICE is going after people who they have information on, and those tend to be the people in a process to remain here legally.
Of course, we cannot ignore that these kinds of very dramatic enforcements affect families? I mean, Eric has a wife and children. What has this been like for his family?
Cynthia, his wife, wrote a letter to the judge. A lot of these, there's a lot of heartbreaking letters being written to judges, like pleading for these loved ones' release. She suffers from severe anxiety and depression, she said in her letter to the judge. Eric helped her cope and function day to day. He helped her manage her medications, provided her with emotional support. And without him, she wrote, I fear I would experience severe depressive episodes or suicidal thoughts again. Now, this obviously would have implications for her young family. They have two children two toddlers. So yeah, it's been brutal on the family. And now, I mean, the other thing that's unstated here is like the cost of these defenses. Like he has a GoFundMe now, trying to get $5,000 because like it's so expensive to, number one, try to get freed when you have been rounded up unlawfully without a bond hearing. But number two, pursue your case to remain in the country. And again, he is somebody who was brought here by his parents as a teenager, has been here for, I think it was like 19 years.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. My guest is Violet Ekonomova. She's an investigative reporter for the Detroit Free Press. We're discussing her reporting on immigrant arrests and detentions in Michigan and when the Trump administration has been violating legal processes. When we come back, we're going to look at how local police are working with ICE or not, what local leaders are saying, and what ICE is saying. Stay with us. It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent, and I'm speaking with Violet Ekonomova. She's an investigative reporter for the Detroit Free Press. We're talking about her reporting on immigrant arrests and detentions in Michigan and how the Trump administration has been violating legal processes here. Now, Violet, I'm wondering what ICE and immigration officers have been saying about detaining people and holding people without a bond hearing, because something I've noticed working as a journalist during this time is that ICE has been a lot more communicative with journalists. Yes. It used to be that you would send a email for information to ICE, and it would be like putting a message in a bottle and sending it into space, right? You'd never hear anything again. And so we would have to independently verify what we could when it came to arrests. But now it appears that there is a mandate by ICE to be much more communicative and to make sure that the goals of the Trump administration are being clearly communicated. So with that said, what have they been saying to you?
Well, I'm trying to see, I can't recall if they responded about the judges, but so there is something I should make clear that the bond, a lot of these decisions before it goes to a federal judge saying you've been illegally detained, this person's case, a detainee's case, will be playing out in immigration court because it's a civil offense that they're accused of oftentimes. Not a criminal offense is what you're saying. Exactly. Like an immigration offense is only a felony in cases where you've already been ordered deported and you've left the country and you've come back. Other than that, the offenses range from civil to a misdemeanor. So a lot of these cases play out in under immigration judges who are administrative staff under the Department of Justice. Trump's Department of Justice. So we did get a response from the Department of Justice on the question of, you didn't give all these people bond hearings. Why are they now? Why are judges saying you erred? And they said that the judges were throwing temper tantrums and insulting the intelligence. I mean, just a very bombastic response, insulting the professionalism of our dedicated immigration judges with their activist rulings. These federal judges simply disagree with the outcomes of immigration judge bond decisions, the statement said.
Violet, can I jump in here
Yeah.
for a moment? Because something that was striking to me, though, is that it is both judges who have been appointed by Democrat and Republican presidents who have ruled in this way, saying that the Trump administration is in violation of people's rights. Is that right?
Yes, including Michigan Radio found that a Trump-appointed judge in the Western District was ruling that these were unlawful detentions, a Judge Hala Jarboe.
Okay. And so I interrupted the statement, though, that you were reading.
So
us
anyway,
there.
they say that their read on the law is incorrect, and that they're being activists simply because they disagree with Trump's immigration program, but that the program itself, these detentions, are legal. That's their argument.
Okay, so they're accusing judges of being activist judges. We have been seeing a pattern of this anytime a judge rules in a way that the Trump administration doesn't like. Meanwhile, civil rights attorneys, unsurprisingly, are up in arms about the fact that the Trump administration isn't following the law. I realize you've spoken to several. What are they saying to you? Why are they so distraught by the actions of ICE and immigration officials?
I mean, these detentions to just pluck people, especially like when they're complying with the rules, to put them in jail for months. I've heard activists will say things like, these are internment camps. Like, no bond hearing is not something we as you and I are American citizens that we can really wrap our heads around, to just be thrown and locked up. And the guy we reported on, Carlos Santo Domingo Sanchez, no idea of whether he'll get out, when he'll get out. Imagine just day after day. A suicide attempt happens in the cell next to him. He doesn't know what happens to the guy. Like, these are not conditions where people can stay well regulated, or it's like, these are abhorrent. This is an abhorrent situation for him. And what his attorney said to me, I found really fascinating, was his attorney is new to immigration law. And he said before he started to do this, he wasn't that abreast of the issue and how these things were playing out. And he said he was sort of the Fox News mindset of, immigration, we got to curb it. And he said now that he's seen this, it's the most dystopian thing he's seen every day. He's not of that mindset at all anymore.
So what you're saying is that a hardliner on immigration, because of what he's observed, this is now changing his mind about this kind of aggressive immigration enforcement.
Right.
I have to quickly pull you personally into the conversation here, Violet, because you're an immigrant yourself.
Yes.
You came here from Bulgaria, is that right?
Yes. Uh-huh.
What has it been like for you as an immigrant, as someone who I'm going to assume saw the U.S. as a place of great opportunity as a kid coming here? What has it been like for you to report on this?
I feel like I don't even know what listeners are going to think of what I'm about to say. I was not initially super up in arms about the immigration program, because I assumed that I believe that you can't have completely open borders, because the people that hurts the most is the last immigrant who came in legally. And so I kind of have complicated personal views on this. And I do believe that some border maintenance is an appropriate thing, in that it helps immigrants who are already in the country. When I saw how this was unfolding, that is what drove me to report on it, because it's people who are complying with the laws, who've been here or trying to comply with the laws, or who've been here for decades. My litmus test was really the public polling about what average citizens want or don't want this program to look like. And yeah, so really I've kind of set myself out of it. But of course, it's an important issue for me because, this could have been, it could be me at some point. Yes, I'm a citizen, but they've been saying that they might go after naturalized citizens next. There was like a story a couple months ago. I was telling my editor, I can't remember who reported it. I think it might have been NBC. They had an exclusive where there was maybe going to be a quota to get naturalized citizens, 200 of them per. I couldn't remember. Maybe it was like a per week or something. And I was like, what if I get thrown into Baldwin, North Lake Detention Center for months without a hearing? So it's very easy to put myself in these people's shoes at the same time.
Sure. I mean, when we talk about America, America is an immigration story. And it's a story of immigration, whether you're very close to it or maybe a couple generations removed. I mean, that is where everyone comes from, is immigrants. And it's interesting, though, to hear your perspective as a newer immigrant, as someone who's much closer to this situation. I want to now close out by talking about local police, because a lot of what's happening right now can't happen without the cooperation of local police. And often immigrants are being sent to ICE detention because they're involved in traffic stops by police officers. And that's true even though many police departments say they can't enforce federal immigration law, or they won't. Violet, how common is it that someone will be pulled over by a cop and then sent to ICE detention?
We don't really have immediate stats on this, but the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center, they have thrown out stats from time to time, periodically. Christine Sauve, who we spoke to for this story, she has previously said, we got X amount of cases this week, like half of them came from like local police. We do know that it might be exacerbated in Michigan versus other states because when I say immigration authorities, I'm referring to ICE, but I'm also referring to Customs and Border Protection, under which Border Patrol operates. And so Border Patrol in the state of Michigan, because of our proximity to Canada and the Great Lakes, they have permission to treat the entire state as a border zone, so they can effect arrests anywhere. And a lot of these police departments have long-standing relationships with Border Patrol specifically. That was the main form of contact I was seeing. It wasn't so often that police departments would just call ICE. They would call Border Patrol more frequently. And so the ACLU did a big study on this. Their last data pull was they published in 2021. From 2012 to, I think it was 19, half of Border Patrol apprehensions over that span of years had come to them from local law enforcement. And identity verification was the primary issue. So these were traffic stops by local law enforcement, but the reason they're calling customs or they're calling Border Patrol is because folks have an ID that the officer says they don't either recognize, or if it's a foreign driver's license, it hasn't been translated. And so they must call immigration to learn who this person is.
All right. So the fact that Detroit is a big border town is further adding some complexities to this, and the fact that we're dealing with multiple law enforcement agencies, both federal and local. And let's be real, none of these agencies have ever been great about transparency and about their protocols.
Yeah, so a lot of them say a lot of them they were forthright. They were like, yeah, we don't enforce immigration law, quote unquote, but it is our practice to call ICE every time we see a foreign license or whatever, these kinds of cases. So I was kind of surprised to hear that. And then, so I asked, my question was, is that a distinction without a difference then? Like you're contributing to the immigration campaign because you're putting somebody on a pathway that we now know that this can result in a months-long illegal detention. And I asked this of the Clay Town. I explained to the Clay Township. Clay Township is a border town right along Lake St. Clair. 8,000 people live there. I asked their police chief about a case where they got a woman with an international driver's license. All of these are routine traffic stops, by the way. It's not like, someone's just robbed a bank and is driving away. After a routine traffic stop, they got a woman with an international driver's license. His officer didn't know what to do with it. And then, so the officer called Border Patrol. This woman landed in ICE detention for at least 2.5 months before a judge determined her detention was unlawful. And I asked the chief there, and he said, it sounds like her case is unfortunate. Everyone deserves their day in court. It's kind of terrible if you have to wait months for something and you were just driving without the proper paperwork. And he goes, but who else do we try to call to get answers? In terms of, they wanted to see who this woman was. They say they have to be able to identify somebody to make sure they're not a criminal. Well, the ACLU of Michigan says, no, that's not really the way you need to go about this. If somebody has an ID that is insufficient, you can give them a ticket for having an invalid identification or for lacking identification altogether. That is a Michigan state law, and the argument from immigrant and civil rights advocates is that the local PD can keep that in-house. That's not something they need to refer out.
But police departments are not used to operating in silos, right? They are very accustomed to working with federal agencies. So it's not surprising to hear that they would be looking to a federal agency to try and confirm this person's identity, especially in this climate right now.
Right.
And this leads me to the question, Violet. Police departments are technically governed by mayors and city councils and city managers. How are local leaders in the suburbs right now reacting to police working with ICE or Border Patrol?
It's been interesting. Like in different places, we're getting different responses. Like in Sterling Heights, the mayor has been very vocal, doesn't want his police department working with them at all.
I've had him on the show saying those exact words.
Yeah. But the police agency says it didn't change any of its policies in response, which I actually don't understand. I didn't personally report out this case. It's just what I've seen in the news. I don't know how a police chief mayors appoint them, how they can just do their own thing. But anyway, that's their jurisdiction's issue. But it really depends, like what side of the political aisle these folks are on. I covered the Mary Sheffield campaign for mayor and Detroit's new mayor, and she hasn't been that vocal about this kind of stuff because part of her, what I have understood her approach to be, is to kind of keep a low profile from Donald Trump.
Right. To stay under the radar are some of the words that her administration has used. Violet, I want to end on something that you mentioned earlier in the conversation, that Stephen Miller, the architect of President Trump's mass deportation campaign, how he wants a moratorium on immigration from so-called third world countries until we can, quote, heal ourselves as a nation. Now, that reporting came from the New York Times. We're only, over a year into the Trump administration. I'm wondering what you think immigration arrests and detentions, how they might change in Michigan over the next few years.
What I think is, I'm not sure. I haven't reported this, but I think that the rest of the country, as Miller gets quieter with his agenda, I think what the rest of the country is going to see is more of a case by case, stop by stop unfurling of this, as Michigan has seen. I think they're moving away from the politically unpopular, flashy Minneapolis crackdown, and Michigan actually could potentially be a blueprint.
So quieter doesn't mean that it's happening less. It's just happening more underneath the surface, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Violet Ekonomova, investigative reporter for the Detroit Free Press. Violet, thank you so much for your reporting.
Thanks for having me on.
It's the Metro on WDET. Coming up, Detroit's police have been effectively reducing crime. But now the department's forensic operation is under fire for mishandling evidence and compromising criminal cases. That all came to light in a recent public meeting. The Detroit documenters were in the room for it. We'll hear more from them next on the Metro. Stay with us.